We are going to talk exclusively in English. You may get such a headset. New Modus Carolina Buster is the former editor-in-chief of Texte zur Kunst, Music and Internet. They operate this postcard on culture, critique and internet phenomena, supported by Daniel Keller. We have heard so much about them. I will be very brief. I would say the interesting thing is it's one of those much acclaimed self-organizations, a spin-off of an existing organization, which has an enormous radiation. We are looking forward to listening to you.
Resuming 6 days
Also
of
6
discussions.
Tage.
Thank you, Julian and Carly.
Okay, cool. Okay, and I think we also, not yet, we also have a slide that we'll put up, not yet. Okay, cool. Okay, hi, and first of all, hi, Julian.
Hi.
Carly. Hi, Caroline Busta. We're so thrilled to be now in the final reaches of this conference. And thank you, Koya and Angela, for not only putting on this massive conference, but also for trusting us with this roundup that we're going to try to facilitate and give you right now. If anyone's coming for the first time, know that this conference is massive. It's encompassed 90-some participants in 2 cities across 6 days. So a special congratulations to Koya and to Angela and to the many, many other people who made this possible. Not least the translators whose technical skill and endurance is, at least from our perspective, Olympic. So maybe we could just have a round of applause for our translators, which are just... So vielen Dank for unsiloing these 2 languages. Okay, so when we first addressed this conference last week in Bonn, it was our aim to speak about the media infrastructure in which our work, all of our work, exists. The subsequent keynotes and conversations went on to fill in that space with the content and terms of critical engagement. We've been asked to take a few minutes now before the final talk, which is Matt Dryhurst and Hito Starel in conversation with Joshua Citarella, to offer a kind of heat map of what the Congress has addressed, right? So this is like the Cliff Notes to the conference. The way we want to do this is we want to spend about 10 minutes pulling out some highlights from the past 3 days and maybe also from the previous week. And then about another 10, asking you all, the critics in residence here, to respond to some questions that we have and that we've gathered over the conference, we've heard from people during the conference. So we're gonna preview these questions so you can turn them over in your mind as we babble on for 10 minutes. And hopefully you'll all have really great answers by then. Do you want to just say them back and forth? Might as well.
Sure.
Okay. So for one big question is just what is our collective definition of critique? This is the future of critique. What do we mean by that, right? So maybe somebody could provide a succinct definition of what we think of when we think of critique.
What were the criteria for a meaningful debate in this conference? As well as critics, do we consider the conversations that we've had over the past 2 weekends actually critical, as in urgent and necessary? If so, in what way, and what was the most valuable takeaway for you all?
Yeah, and we say this in the context of there's an energy crisis, there's obviously major geopolitical concerns, there's inflation. There are a lot of real world issues that kind of went to the edges during this conference. And so how do we make a case for what we do actually matters in that wider scope? What was the most valuable thing that you're taking from this conference in that big world scope? So for what future is this future of critique conference for? Could you animate it? Could someone paint a picture of what the landscape will look like, say, in 2050 or 2030 or even 2023? Like, what do you imagine an audience for like any kind of criticality to be on a longer timeline in that future? What is that future? So maybe someone can have an idea of that.
What audience has this Congress aimed to produce? A Carly favorite is that publications don't produce content as much as they produce audiences.
Exactly.
We always think of magazines as producing an audience, and that's the most important thing they do rather than...
Yeah, I mean, they also sell that audience then to advertisers, and there's a relationship there, but what audience does this Congress set out to produce? And what is the archive for thought in a time of increasing decentralization? So we can talk about practicing criticism, but where does that criticism go? How is it archived in a way that can be meaningfully accessed in the future?
And finally, there's a question of the instrumentalization of critique, which can happen in the hands of political parties, but even by the critic themselves, especially in an era of an all-encompassing attention economy. Sometimes the critic has something to gain from making a certain critique. Exactly. And how should that, and if it should affect our assessment of the value of a critique, the way it's been instrumentalized?
So hold on to those questions. We're going to do it as like a speed round at the end of this, so only like 1 or 2 answers per question, depending on our time. But just think those over for a second. In the meantime, you can just look at this map, which we know the German's not perfect, but you know, it's a big compromise, all of this, like translation's never perfect, but hopefully there's enough information in both languages to make this viable. In our perception, these were some of the major issues that came to the fore during this conference. We can unpack this further. Maybe you can also critique it, but let this just animate what we're about to say. Okay.
I think you have a small observation.
Oh, it was interesting. Like, we think about how now in Twitch and YouTube, we're so used to comments in real time and like deciding, you know, if you're watching a sporting match or you're watching a political debate, you're probably with your friends chatting in real time on DM or in Discord. And it was interesting being in a physical conference and not having the ability to feedback in real time. Like, you know, sometimes it's catty stuff or snarky, but sometimes it's like done with love, right? Or you sort of pull out language and you collectively identify it. It was interesting not having, you could do that on YouTube, but it was interesting not having that in real time. So, which is a thought.
And also there's some crowd dynamics that might affect the critique or the result of what you took away, depending if it's strangers or your peers. I mean, swarm critique might be a whole new field of study.
That's true. Yeah, definitely. Well, anyway, without further ado, let's recap.
Over the course of this conference, there were some questions raised that have sort of always been questions raised when discussing criticism. What stuck out to me, namely, was the concerns over the elitism or the hierarchical nature of criticism. Of course, there's worries about gatekeeping, a thought that flat hierarchies when it comes to critical authority leads to a more democratic assessment. I'm of the opinion that the future of critique can leave hand-wringing over elitism in the past. Social media has given a voice to everyone, but it is, of course, a voice bound by physics that sort of warps everything within it. And we know the results of this. It's polarization and a tendency towards essentializing identity and political positions, and a method of valuation that has little to do with deeper thinking, historical precedents, or a necessary complexity.
On the other hand, this turn towards populism has also widened the gap between the critics and the market. While, let's be honest, the art market has never truly been tempered by criticism, at least the regions, criticism and commerce, knew each other. They even needed each other, or at least understood how each other worked. But now, the market and criticism exist in entirely different solar systems. But we're thinking, rather than lamenting this, maybe we can acknowledge that our ultimate job as critics is not to keep tabs on the market, but rather on other systems of valuation that govern what we make and say and do. To take the aggregate responses from these past days of discussion, we think the answer might be twofold. To at once retain the technical craft of thinking theoretically about the aesthetic world, as was laid out this morning by Robert Kudielka and on Thursday evening by Santoran Verataraja, but to do so always with a mind for the terrain in which it circulates. So it is really important, this craft of criticism. It's not something we should jettison, but we have to be aware of how that thinking then transmits through a system. Oh, that's me again. So before speaking more about the practical, a note on German critical art discourse. The particular philosophical terms and intellectual canon familiar to Germans can be a barrier for non-Germans who wish to participate with confidence in German-led discussion. I know this is not a popular take, but this is our experience. So, this can often create frustration or limit the reach of the ideas offered here. Yet, maybe the way to think about this, rather than railing against a kind of closed club or elitism, is to see it as a local form of critique, a prized local discourse. As Americans exposed to the German canon, it reminds us that there are many possible forms of discourse. There's like MTV discourse, and there's also like, a return to thinking deeply about Kant. They're both valuable, and they're both possible. By better understanding German critique, we can better understand how valuation of aesthetic material works in a German context. So there is a place for it, for sure. We should just think about it as maybe a local kind of discourse.
This kind of art criticism also was the subject of a question asked at least 2 times over the course of this conference, once after our lecture in Bonn and once yesterday here in Berlin. What about this legacy or true art criticism specifically? What is its future? We imagine those who value it will continue to practice it for a particular community. And we might then ask a question we ask of our own community as new models. Isn't it okay if it doesn't scale? If, on the other hand, it were to aim for a conventional success narrative, or if it were to abandon its form and language, it would become something else altogether. Perhaps asking what is the future of this particular kind of art criticism is more a question of preservation and archive, legacy criticism in the future, rather than the future of critique. Also, Alex Scrimger, in the panel he was on, mentioned a specter of a frictionless art world, one without criticism. Frictionlessness is a word you hear a lot in tech or UX when designing apps, or the way the internet and particularly shopping works more broadly. And frictionless, of course, is sort of this aspirational state for capitalism. And it's also become a sort of expectation for those of us who grew up online. But while friction slows things down and makes things require more effort, friction also makes heat and energy. So criticism is a generative friction, and any plea to frictionlessness should raise a few eyebrows.
I particularly appreciated Kate Brown yesterday in that same conversation. She noted how difficult it is to find something that you disagree with online. I mean, in broad strokes, the algorithm tries really hard. Algorithms try, your feed tries really hard to serve you information that you want to click on, that you want to linger on. So the challenge is actually finding something that you disagree with, right? Or that you can engage critically with.
Yeah, I think it's this kind of sweet spot between something like you don't so vehemently disagree with that you just like skip right over it.
Exactly.
But something that actually challenges you, that actually, makes you want to engage in a sort of a real discourse, an actual effortful discourse.
Right. True criticism is rare and desirable.
You're going to have to read this first sentence.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I have to freestyle this. I think what you were going to say, and I miswrote this, was that one thing that you really stuck with you this past week were some of the interestingly paradoxical quotes that Nikita Devan offered.
Right.
Yeah.
So Nikita Devan, she quoted Derrida, every time I open my mouth, I say too much, and I don't say enough. And she also quoted Pat Parker, who was talking about if you're a white person and you want to be friends with a black person. And the quote is, the first thing you do is to forget that I'm black. The next thing is to never forget that I'm black. Nikita also noted that critique is not just about an act of superiority, of showing the other person is wrong, but recognizing the limits of one's own thought. So this all made me think about these paradoxical quotes, and the last quote about critique not just being an act of showing the other person is wrong, is that sometimes the most effective critique takes us from a place of knowing to a place of not knowing, rather than the other way around. And I was thinking how in such a polarized time of so many different competing truths, perhaps we're more likely to find a broad shared space, a shared baseline reality, which is rather fraught these days. Perhaps we could find it through a collective not knowing, rather than any attempt to assert one truth over the other.
Right, and again, these platforms, I know we're probably overly focused on platforms, but they do nudge you to take a stance, to have an opinion. Silence is violence has been, twisted to now mean that you must say something even if you haven't had time to reflect.
Also you're used to asking a question and then frictionlessly being provided with an answer.
Yeah.
Some things don't really have friction.
Clear answers, yeah.
Frictionlessly
Exactly.
obtainable answers. Again,
yeah.
Holger Liebs mentioned a poster campaign by the Nigerian artist Emeka Ogba in the city of Dresden. 200 posters, I believe, were displayed as public advertisements, with each showing the measurements and an image of one of the bronze sculptures taken from Benin in the colonial era and held in the Dresden's Museum for Volkerkunde, along with the word vermisst, which is missing. This artwork did not assert a position or use a slogan to claim a truth or even make a demand. It was a critique that allowed the viewers themselves to find their own position, to think about and perhaps discover a truth on their own. It's a critique that does not start from a place of knowing, but it does lead to one. Nobody likes being told that they're wrong, but people will change their mind when they do so under their own agency. Something else about this form of critique, it's more difficult to instrumentalize. Holger Liebs also mentioned the opportunistic use of so-called critique by the AfD party here in Germany. But today we see the critical, what did you do there, Carl?
I don't know. Well, we see criticality instrumentalized by everyone everywhere.
Even the critics themselves sometimes instrumentalizing their own critiques for gains in the attention economy. Nikita Devan talked about the narcissism of certain critiques from the West in her keynote in Bonn. How should the instrumentalization of critique affect the way we assess its value? Should we, when assessing critique, should we ask who might gain from it and how? Of course, now I'm talking about the critique of critique, and it's probably best to wait to address this subject until the future of critique Congress taking place next year with panels running through 2039.
One more thought on Emeka Ogbo's Vermis posters in Dresden, a project which points to another issue discussed in this Congress. Where and when does critique become marketing? And doesn't even matter if the two overlap? The strategy here in her posters, their posters, took a surprising turn of language addressing a physical public. And this reminds of a dynamic like, of an advertising campaign, like 1980 Saatchi and Saatchi. I have the sense, though, that if we're going to find the edges of criticism future, we need to be comfortable with these crossovers, insofar as they organically produce a public. It's a fine line between sensationalism and intelligent engagement, but Ogbo's project perhaps hits this sweet spot. As critics, we can become arbiters of attention hacking. Yesterday, a man who had been a critic many years ago, or for many years, noted that the job of an art reviewer was to assess whether the show or film or piece of theater is worth the viewer's time. Perhaps now critics can give, all of you, can help give your assessment of whether a work is, theater or whatnot, is worth the viewer's engagement, or if instead it leads to some kind of needless amygdala stimulation. A critic might also help diagram cui bono, who benefits from a work that's being shown, and what labor is the viewer doing in validating it with attention. Like, these are the new terms of attention that I hope that we as critics can really spend time thinking about. These new economies are desperately underdefined, and as critics, it is something that we've been long trained to do. So maybe this is a way to reorient what criticism might do going forward in the future.
In the segment of her film, Julieta Aranda showed during her talk with John Miller, there was a quote that stuck with me: "A world mediated by a faulty image of the world." We are more than ever thinking and communicating in this faulty image of the world, that is, the cloud simulation of the world. Centurion Varantaraja, did I say that right, traced this all the way back to Plato's primacy of mind over body, the origin point of humanity's perilous journey into greater and greater abstraction. From this faulty image of the world can only come faulty critique, faulty debate, and faulty discourse. Jimmy Robert said critique must come from care. It is easy not to care within this faulty image of the world, where all others are abstracted others. In this faulty image of the world, critique is weaponized on an ideological digital battlefield. Weaponized critique cannot be critique from care unless one can weaponize care. Weaponized care does sound like the title of an interesting panel discussion, but for now, it will remain in the faulty image of my imagination.
I'm just noticing, though, that we have like 7 or 8
know,
minutes yet. So should we speed read or should we? I know we're so bad.
Go for it. Okay.
It is okay? Okay.
In the last panel, Verena Luken mentioned that without criticism, we'll suffocate from mediocrity. But she also asked, who decides what is mediocre?
Kritik nur Mittelmäßigkeit gibt. Und dann hat sie auch gefragt, wer entscheidet denn, was mittelmäßig ist? In der Zeit der massenhaft verfügbaren Daten kann man das quantifizieren. Es ist der messbare Modus des Markts, also das, was von der größten Anzahl an Menschen gewollt wird, also eine andere mögliche Tyrannei, aber der Diktator ist kein Mensch. Netflix hat natürlich Mittelmäßigkeit auf einem massigen Ausmaß und zeigt auch oder versucht zu verstehen, was die meisten Leute sehen wollen. Es kann natürlich auch die Mittelmäßigkeit, man kann natürlich auch selbst fragen, wie kann denn ein Film überhaupt Mittelmäßigkeit erreichen, aber es stimmt natürlich, dass Kritik die Kunst nach vorne treibt. Abgesehen von diesen Fällen der Mittelmäßigkeit wäre das auch möglich auch im digitalen Raum. Ja, aber nur wenn es auch eben Peers, also Gleichgesinnte oder Kolleginnen und Kollegen gibt und nicht nur Fremde. Lynn Miklix hat heute gesagt, dass ein Tweet auch ein tiefes Lesen beinhalten kann. Das stimmt, aber dieser Tweet würde trotzdem nicht skalierbar sein. Eine Krise der Kritik ist auch eine Krise der Skalierbarkeit. Es ist auch eine wirtschaftliche Kritik und die Kritik wird, der Wert der Kritik wird herabgesetzt. Das wurde auch während dieser Konferenz unterstrichen. Wir müssen hier vielleicht noch einmal zur einfachsten Frage zurückkehren. Das war hier immer im Schatten der Konferenz, aber wir müssen das vielleicht jetzt endlich mal fragen. Was ist Kritik? Wenn wir auch fragen, was Kritik nicht ist, kann das auch nützlich sein. Kritik ist zum Beispiel nicht Aktivismus oder Instruktion. Aber das heißt nicht, dass Aktivismus und Instruktion nicht auch wichtig ist. Aber vielleicht muss es ja einen Unterschied geben oder eine Unterscheidung geben.
Hoffentlich
werden wir in ein paar Minuten das Mikro an ein oder zwei Personen aus dem Publikum übergeben, aber diese Konferenz hat natürlich Komplexität zu der Frage der Zukunft der Kritik hinzugefügt. Wir haben nicht viele Wahrheiten und Antworten gegeben. Wir haben viel mehr Fragen jetzt als zu Beginn.
Speed round. We're going to force the speed round onto you and ask you some of the questions that we asked in the beginning.
Fragen stellen, und zwar welche, die wir am Anfang gefragt haben. Also wir wollen natürlich weiter hier mit dieser Schnelligkeit weitermachen. Also bitte halten Sie sich relativ kurz, damit so viele Menschen wie möglich auch die Möglichkeit haben, hier teilzunehmen. Mit welcher Frage sollen wir anfangen? Mit der großen Frage. Was ist denn eine funktionierende Definition von Kritik? Was ist die zukünftige funktionierende Definition von Kritik? Möchte das jemand versuchen? Vielleicht können wir ja jemanden kriegen oder ans Mikro kriegen, der Deutsch spricht und jemanden, der Englisch spricht. Das muss nicht sein, aber das wäre natürlich schön. Möchte jemand hier mutig sein und vorpreschen?
Ja? Cool.
I'm glad at least one person had an idea of what critique is at the Future of Critique Conference.
Ich bin jetzt froh, dass jemand, wenigstens eine Person, eine Ahnung davon hat, was die Zukunft der Kritik sein könnte. Auf dieser Konferenz zur Zukunft der Kritik.
First.
Okay, but you have to keep this really short, so I would stand. Yeah, at the edge. Because you're going to be on for quick.
Yeah. That's it? So your question?
Yeah. You're going to give a definition of critique.
Yeah. Well, okay, then I got to add a little discourse and think about it, that something that you do must always be good.
Okay.
In English, that be the adjective wertvoll.
It has a value. Yeah.
Very valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah. So critique is valuable doing. And to become valuable, I'd say we must listen carefully, act in care, plus, participate.
Okay. Thank you for coming to this TED Talk.
Working definition of critique. Future critique, like future looking.
Yes. I'm starting with the first part that I will then modify, which would be evaluation grounded on reasons, which seemed to be implicit, especially when some rejected the term of critic for themselves because they were now working for a gallery or for a museum and didn't assume the role of evaluating art, at least with the potential of evaluating it negatively as well. Now, what I really kind of think the Congress added is, and that's how I modify the definition, is that it's caring, doubtful, impure, and vulnerable evaluation based on reasons, experiences, contexts, and forms.
I like that. It's very nice. Yeah. It's like an actively recalibrating form of critique. It's not something that's fixed. It's something that just like everything, in the time of algorithms being able to respond very quickly, criticism should also not be fixed or return to baseline understanding, but a fluid one.
Also mentioning vulnerability and being a bit unsure kind of discounts the more limbic critique we see deployed on social media, the ones that are fun and exciting and sort of adrenalizing to create. I think those are generally not going to be good, and you can't trust them because they're fun.
True. Is there another? Or Koya, would you even want to offer yours or anything? Okay.
We could also ask another question.
We can also ask another question.
Or we can, it's 1 minute till 6, so.
Take the time, really. I love the format. Is that okay, Angela? I think no one will leave. No worries. Let's take 10 more minutes.
Okay.
Maybe can I give the question back to you, because sure. You're doing critique ad hoc, right? So you are actually taking everything what has been said in the last panels and saying, well, actually the question, what critique is, has been missing. This is what this social and cultural literacy is asked for through the textual or the event, the critical event, such as here. So the premise to say what critique is a philosophical figure or a practice, a cultural practice that was first in the press and then atomized, as we can see it in your here in this JPEG. What is in the background? What is on the backside of this image? What do you think is critique? Because this was actually as given, and maybe as also Verena Luken said, is placing something that is not there between the viewer and the object of art, the film, the music piece.
Is the question then, like, what's behind the definition of critique that this is contingent on?
Behind the backside of this image is maybe your definition of critique that you're missing in this context?
Sure. So I think, I mean, how to say it succinctly? I mean, I would come back to this idea of critical distance and just trying to understand how the machinations of value work. And it's been our experience in our lives and our careers in the past 10 years that those have changed dramatically. And so I guess we're trying to show the machine a bit, right? That would be our working definition of critique. It's not everybody's. But and it's interesting to hear so many different relationships to criticism might be, some that are very theoretical, that really wouldn't have a lot of use for this diagram. It really would be a distraction. But our belief is that that kind of thinking still exists within this infrastructure. So in order for it to have any kind of success or ability to transport or remain, it needs to be aware of the infrastructure.
I mean, sure, I'm not an academic, but I mean, I do approach critique also, though, as a form of a very scope-aware mapping or understanding flows of power, incentives, and also a way of both challenging the subject of your critique while challenging yourself, trying to extract as much as possible and really trace and build out the world as thoroughly as you can.
So should I ask one more question, or do you think, okay, Julian, which of these do you think? Should we either animate the future of Critique Congress, or should we ask, like, what's been meaningful in this debate?
Or what about the audience?
What audience is it produced? I think that maybe you like the most meaningful.
That's a good one.
Yeah?
No? Yeah. That's a good one?
Yeah. Should I translate to German maybe, so German speakers also feel invited?
Which audience is anticipated by this Congress?
What public has this Congress anticipated, or has it produced? What does the person who comes to this Congress value? Why are you here at Saturday night? Answer that question.
Maybe your questions also work silently.
Totally. It's true.
I hear many heads humming. Next question.
Well, I think one of the things this Congress has...
Unfortunately, the speaker isn't really using the microphone, so I can't really hear him. So, asking the question briefly before the end of the Congress, well, of course you can ask the question. You should always be able to ask the question what the reason is of why we're all here. I don't know, but I'm trying to draw up a summary and try to figure out what kind of audience this Congress has produced, I think is a bit absurd. In a friendly I understand his objection, but I would like to add that the audience that this Congress anticipates is also the one that it produced, an audience full of people who come from film critics, but they speak to journalists and people such as Carly and Julian that produce audience that some of you might not have heard before, but still have a certain power in the avant-garde and many other areas. It produces an audience that deals with international politics with regard to the Kurds and the German responsibility with regard to its own history and the military deployment in Afghanistan. So it's an extremely diverse audience. So as one of the organizers of this conference, that was a real benefit and added value. And I think that's also the reason why we had terms of criticism, of critique that are fluid and that allow for the fluidity that Klaus Speidel just mentioned. So, with Tito Steyer, we could maybe say critique and free fall.
I mean, I think it is true that there's diverse audiences for critique, and more so now than ever. Already we're speaking in 2 languages, right? But it is, I think, interesting to think about who the audience is for any critical action. And the Congress has done a great job trying to speak to many different publics at once, I think, during these past 6 days. So should we end it there then? Yes or no? Shall we keep going?
No.
Do you have a resume? I mean, feel free.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. But we can also just ask about this future. This is sort of this other interesting question of like what the future would look like, right?
Let's risk it.
Yeah. Okay. So then what? Okay. So then if we have the question of what public are we producing, the other question is what does a sphere for critical discourse look like next year? In 7 years, in 25 years, what does that look like? What are the terms? Are we circulating print? Are we still using Web 2 media? In the next program, the final program, we'll speak a bit about this, so-called metaverse or Web 3 or other layers of like digital public spheres. So what do we imagine that public sphere to look like in, let's say 10 years, let's say 2030?
I could also maybe expand this a bit because obviously, I mean, if you imagine out to 2030 or 2050, materially, the conditions are going to be very different, which means not only might you imagine, what role critique will have in that future, but also it might frame what role you think it needs to play right now in anticipation of that future.
Does anyone want to paint a picture? Especially if there's anyone who's younger, who's really thinking about what role critique might play in your cultural career in the coming decades?
Well, I think one possible future is obviously there's a moment of what you could call post-critical ascendancy, which is this sense that instead of following this queer theorist Eve Sedgwick, instead of these paranoid readings, they're always seeking to find the hidden structure of domination or whatever within the cultural object that's being reviewed. You read reparatively, right? You read with an attitude that is charitable, that is open, that is receptive to the experience of the work. Now, this is very a la mode. This is very trendy, and it's against a kind of like Marx has this idea of the young Marx has this idea of critique as hand-to-hand combat. This kind of very macho, pugilistic destruction of the object, the brain of passion, not the passion of the brain, the other way around, passion of the brain, not the brain of passion. this seems to be entirely junked now, and I think we should ask about why something like this post-critical idea has, how this plays into what you were earlier referring to as the kind of physics of social media. So for instance, BuzzFeed a few years ago said, when they were advertising for their first kind of book reviews editor, they said, we will not have hatchet jobs, we're not inviting any haters. So the job description said no negative reviews. I mean, this is book reviewing. This is a profession which is like preeminently founded on the art of the hatchet job and of, negative criticism. And I think it's quite concerning that this, under a guise of radicality and because of course there is an idea of reparative criticism that is radical, but there's another one which is basically accommodating and advertorials, essentially, And I think this is definitely, it's gaining ascendancy in quarters where it's actually serving to just shore up an increasingly commercialized and corporate sphere of cultural production. So.
Yeah, thank you for that definition. That was great, or that future scope. That I think was a really important distinction between reparative.
Critique being instrumentalized.
Also.
As well, or yeah.
I mean, I think that also, though, BuzzFeed in, say, what did you say, 2012 or 15 or 2012? Again, the mediascape was quite different in 2012 than it is in 2022. And we were still sort of imagining that space to be something of a public sphere in 2022. Whereas now, where we're all in Discords and DM groups and we're much more fractured, reparative critique also serves the purpose of like bridging communities, saying like we can have an alliance with you, and so okay, we agree on this. And I think there's sort of like, is this happening in ClearNet? In that case, it's like going towards this like PMC hegemonic culture. Is it happening in like dark forest, cozy web spaces? Then it's like maybe bridging two small groups within a shared politics. So I think we have to be judicious about like when we're applying a critique of repair or a critique of like, some kind of reveal or like a more masculine type of critique.
Yeah, I
mean, not to quote it that way, but.
There's this tendency towards essentializing or universalizing everything in the online space, the medias we engage with now. And of course, this conference has made clear that there is a diversity of critiques, of practices of critiques, of languages of critiques. And of course, handle with care.
Is that a good place to wrap up then? Or is there's another? Oh, yes.
I would be trustful that Alex Sprinter has to add something of meaning over there. Last answer.
Make it good, Alex.
I mean, I didn't hear all the panels, but to me, one thing, especially with this question of like, where are we gonna stand in 20, 30 years, is kind of like, the Bruno Latour and why has critique run out of steam? And his argument back then was like, because it gave the climate deniers the toolkit to resist these like brute facts that we will in the next 20 years be ever more kind of exposed to, and and in the context, I think it was after the Iraq War and that kind of thing. So I think for me, like that's also this question about what the future of critique is, when it came up a little bit in the discussion of museums and artworks and climate protesters in museums, but it's like what we do in our nice bubble of the sort of privileged positionality of the critic and of the world of critique, as in your romantic landscape behind you, it's like that's, we're gonna have to like deal with climate grief, and then what the question is, how is, critique going to change in light of like these brute facts that are going to, put not quite an end, but I think they're going to kind of reframe it. That this period is going to be over, where we sort of sit together and talk about what is critique. So that's my fear of, or warning for what might happen in 20 years or whatever.
Well, maybe we leave it with that image, the image of us in 2030 or whatever, with all wearing our down parkas in the same room, addressing what critique could be under those circumstances.
Talking really loud, no microphones.
Right. All right. So thank you. We now have an excellent panel with Matt Dryhurst, Joshua Citarella, and Hito Styrel, if that is still the plan.
That is true. Thank
okay,
you so much, Carly. Thank you so much, Julian, for putting all the energy into this Congress, for opening it last week, for nearly closing it tonight.